Good. Okay, we're recording. Welcome everybody to the Tanya class every Thursday at 10:30. We are holding in the middle of chapter 2, actually towards the end of chapter 2. Let me give you a recap and then we'll continue from where we left off. So the Alter Rebbe, the Rishner Zalman of the Adi, the author of the Tanya, he is trying to figure out what it is, the purpose of man on this world, what's the direction we're trying to reach, and how to live really an inspired life, where even though you have you get up in the morning sometimes and you don't feel the perfect way that you'd like to feel, nonetheless, you're able to serve God within those feelings themselves. And he starts off by telling us that essentially somebody who studies the Tanya is somebody who is coming into a yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe. And he's telling the Rebbe, listen, I have my challenges, I have my spiritual challenges, and I'd like to serve God better. I'd like to be a better human being, a better Jew, more connected. And please, Rebbe, give me advice. Tell me what's going on within my heart, within my soul. Tell me what's going on. And the Rebbe told us that there's come a point in a time where I could no longer see people in private audiences due to the lack of time and ability and the great amount of people that need guidance. So I've written this book to give healing to your soul. So when a person reads this book, he's really in a private audience with the Rebbe. So he starts off in chapter 1 and he asks the question basically, is perfection attainable? Is the goal perfection? Are we trying to attain perfection in our lives? And the answer that he gave is that we have to really understand what the different personalities of human beings are. So if we look at the broader context of the Torah, you look through the Talmud, you look through the Chumash, you look through God's Torah that he gave us, you really find that there are three personalities, three types of people that exist within the Jewish nation. And they are, of course, Tzaddik, Beinoni, and Rasha. Tzaddik, Beinoni, and Rasha. What are the three categories? So the Rebbe tries to define them, tries to understand them. And basically in chapter 1, he gets to the bottom line. That is that a tzaddik is somebody who really, his life is devoted to God's will, both on the inside and on the outside. He's completely sensitive and connected to living his life exactly the way that God wants him to live. And he doesn't veer off of that path for a moment. And then, of course, there's a Rasha. A Rasha is somebody who is living his life inconsistent with the values of God. Completely, always inconsistent. And then there's somebody who's the Beinoni. And the Alter Rebbe tries to understand who is this Beinoni and what is his prognosis? What is he? Who is he? And he doesn't really get to the bottom of it. But he does tell us that in order to understand what a Beinoni is, we first need to understand something that is written in the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria, and that is that every single Jewish man, woman, and child has within him two souls. Not one, but two souls. And these two souls are really what creates the struggle within man. And he goes on for the rest of chapter 1 explaining to us what is the first soul. The first soul is called the Nefesh HaChiyunis, the human soul, the enlivening soul, the soul that gives life to man. And really, essentially what it is it's the need of the human being for self-preservation. A person knows that he exists and he needs to push himself to make sure that every decision that he makes allows for his self-preservation, for his self-continuity, allows himself to exist. That's the first soul. And Alter Rebbe told us that the negative inclinations of man, the personalities of man that give way to selfishness, that give way to pleasure, to idle chatter, to boastfulness, to depression, anxiety, all of these negative character traits of a human being, they all stem from this soul. And not only that, even the good character traits within a human being also stem from this very soul. And that is the ability to be kind, the ability to be merciful, the ability to be giving to other people. Those character traits also stem from this very place, from this first soul. So it seems that we've covered everything. So why is it necessary to have a second soul? And where does the second soul come from? So here we begin in chapter 2 with what the Alter Rebbe tells us is really something very unique to the Jewish identity, uniquely Jewish. And that is, within every single Jew, there is the godly soul as well. The godly soul. What is the godly soul? So the Alter Rebbe first tells us the personality of the godly soul. He tells us the essence of the godly soul. What is the essence of the godly soul? The essence of the godly soul is, welcome Carlos, come sit down. The essence of the godly soul is, and he gives an example. He gives kind of a metaphor to understand what the godly soul is. What the godly soul is. And here is the metaphor. The metaphor is, if you take all of the Jewish souls that exist for all of time, and you consider them like one body, and each and every spiritual soul, every single human being, every single godly soul is created as one body. We all share the same exact spiritual DNA. So we all share the same spiritual DNA because we're all, very interestingly, the Alter Rebbe tells us that all of creation was created by God. But this godly soul was not created by God. This godly soul is a piece of God. All of existence was created by God, but a Jew has a piece of God that wasn't created by God, is God. And that's what makes us so special. That's what makes the Jew so special, because we have a piece of God within us. But this piece of God is, like Alter Rebbe explains to us, when we take all of the Jewish people and we consider them like one body. So what do we get out of that? What does that tell us? That tells us that we're all connected. We're all connected because we're really one entity. We all have one. We have a piece of God within us that's connected to every single Jew. You know what else it tells us? It also tells us, Carlos, that just like we're all connected with the same spiritual DNA, there's also a hierarchy of souls. Some souls are like heart souls. Some souls are like mind, brain souls. Some souls are like feet souls. There are different levels and gradations of souls. And throughout the generations, as the souls descended from their spiritual source, each soul was affected in a different way by the descent, by its spiritual descent, until it enclosed itself in a body. And that's what creates the different levels of souls. But just as a child has the same spiritual DNA in all of his body, right? You take a human being, the feet and the head have the same spiritual DNA, have the same DNA, physical DNA. So too, the soul, the godly soul, because it is a piece of God, and every single Jew has a piece of God within him, we all have the same spiritual DNA. However, this analogy also tells us that some of us have, even though we have the same DNA, some of us are part of the body that's the lower part of the body, and some of us are from the higher part of the body, spiritually speaking. So how is it? The Rebbe tells us, how is it that a Jew could constantly be aware and connected of this godly DNA that exists within him? By connecting to the head. Who's the head? A head is a soul that is spiritually aware of this connection at all times. And that is the soul of a tzaddik. So whereas we have this spiritual DNA, this godly piece within us, we're not always aware of it. In order to connect to the source of this DNA, we connect to a tzaddik. A tzaddik is like the brain, just like the fingers, the toenails, all do their work within the body through the power of the brain. The brain gives the signal to the fingers. The brain gives the signals to the feet. The brain gives the signals to the arm to make them work. So to us, we're all part of the same spiritual DNA. We're all connected. But when we recognize and we connect to the brain level, tzaddikim, to the spiritual giants of the generations, to our Rebbe, who's always aware of his connection to God, we are able to have that connection to God as well. So that is the summary of chapter 2. I'm going to read a little bit of it inside so that I can give you a little bit of this idea of what we're talking about. So we say like this: in order to help us better understand why the levels of individual souls vary so widely despite their common source, Alter Rebbe now returns to the analogy of a father and a son, used earlier to illustrate the description of Jews as God's children, who are derived from Chachmei, God's brain, as it were. Page 56. I'm just going to read a little part, and then I'm going to explain a little bit more. I'm going to put it on the screen, actually, so that if you're with us and you want to read along with us, you can. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can follow along with us. You can find this Chabad.org. And give me a second. I'm going to. Okay, here we are. Let me share my screen. Okay. This is where we're starting from, in order. In order to help us better understand why the levels of individual souls vary so widely, despite their common source, now the Rebbe now returns to the analogy of a father and a son. An explanation in brief. In this analogy, the child's entire body is derived from a drop of semen originating in its father's brain. Think about a child that's created. A child that is created, every body part of the child and every human being, where's the source of it? The source of it is a tiny drop, a piece of coded DNA that is deposited from the father into the mother. This tiny drop has within it every single part of the development, of the future development of the child. The child's entire body is derived from a drop of semen originating in its father's brain. Yet the many physical components which constitute the child's body are by no means uniform. They vary greatly, from the brain component to the nails of the feet, which is the lowest. These radical differences come about through the presence of the drop of semen in the mother's womb during the 9 months of gestation. It is this period of physical development that produces the differences between one organ and another. The more materialized a particular component of the drop becomes, the more it diverges from its original state and becomes an entity with its own unique physical characteristics. We thus observe that though all the organs share a common source, nevertheless, in the process of development, there arise differences as radical as that between brain and nails. Another matter evident from the analogy, though the nails are the most insignificant part of the child's body, they are still bound and united with their first source, the father's brain. For like other parts of the child's body, the nails too receive their nourishment and life from its brain. Sorry about that, my friends. Seems like we got cut off. In short, what you have is like this. You have a human body. The human body, every single part of it comes from the same source. The godly soul also, it stems from one source. So the Alter Rebbe asks, if that's the case, that all souls come from the same source, why are there different levels of souls? And the Alter Rebbe answers, it's analogous to the human body.
Yes.
Are we back? I'm sorry about that, guys.
Yes. Yes.
So let me finish reading, and then I'm going to explain, and we're gonna stop with this idea. So we thus observe. Let me share the screen again. We thus observe that though all organs share a common source, nevertheless, in the process of development, there arise differences as radical as that between brain and nails. Another matter evident from the analogy, though the nails are the most insignificant part of the child's body, they are still bound and united with their first source, the father's brain. So here's where the analogy comes in. The soul, even though the soul comes from the same source, Carlos, right? The soul comes from the source. The soul is a piece of God. And even though we may be a very low spiritual level, the way we live our lives, we're not aware or not in tune with our spiritual selves. So we could be compared almost to like the toenails of the human being, which get such little nourishment from the brain. Nevertheless, those toenails are still connected to the brain. And not only to the child's brain, they're connected to the father's brain, because that's where the source of the human being comes from. In the same way, the same is true regarding the souls. All souls are derived from the same source and root, from Chachma Ilah, from God's brain. But the soul must ascend, therefore, through a multitude of worlds and levels before clothing itself in a physical body. It is this descent that creates changes in the soul's level and differences between one soul and another. From one soul is affected by this descent to a greater degree than another. But the second aspect of the analogy too applies here. Although a soul may descend to a very low level, it is still bound up and unified with its original source in Chachma Ilah. In the analogy, the nails remain bound to the father's brain through their unity with the son's brain. Similarly, these souls of the lowest level remain bound to their source in Chachma Ilah through their attachment to the souls of the righteous and the sages of their generation from whom they receive their spiritual nourishment. So let me stop this and let me just explain what I said. Think about it like this. In the analogy, it's like this. The father deposits a drop of genetic code into the mother, right? This drop of semen contains within it the entire life of the child. As the child develops in the mother's stomach, all of the parts of the child, the brain and the toenails, are all coming and stemming from that same drop. However, once the child is formed and the child comes out and goes into adulthood, the brain and the nails of the child are going to be separate entities, but they still get their source from the same place. They get their source from that drop of semen that the father deposited into the mother. That is the source of the human being. So even though the toenails of the child are constantly alive because they're connected to the brain of the child is connected to the father's brain still, always. So in other words, the toenails are still connected to the father's brain through the brain of the child. And in the same way, the analogy that Alter Rebbe says is the souls that come down. Originally, all souls stem from one source. Where's the source of the souls? The source of the souls are God himself. As the souls come down from that spiritual source, they come into Shnei Hecht and into Malka and into Wayne and into Carlos and into all the people, all the Jewish people. These souls come in. Once they come in, they seem like separate entities. My soul is different than Malka's soul, and Wayne's soul, and Carlos' soul. We're all disconnected, seemingly. But really, if you think about it, we're all one. Why are we all one? Because we are all stemming from the same soul. So even though the toenails and the brain seem like different entities in a body, they all get their source from the same place. And so too, all Jewish souls get their vitality and energy from God himself, because they're a piece of God. But how? They get their vitality through the brain souls. Who are the brain souls? The brain souls are the Talmidei Chachamim, the Rebbes of every generation. And that's why it's so important to connect to a Rebbe, to connect to a spiritual giant. Because although we live our lives in a very human way, in a very materialistic way, we try to be spiritual beings from time to time, but we don't have that spiritual sensitivity like a tzaddik has. When we connect to a tzaddik, that allows us to understand, to figure out, to connect, to be sensitive to our very souls. I'm gonna tell you a story. You probably heard this story from me many times, but it brings out this point. Oftentimes, as we go through life, we're not aware of what our spiritual mission is in life. But a Rebbe who's able to see your soul is able to see them. So I shared the story with you before, but I'm going to share it again. There was the Israeli ambassador. His name, Yehuda Avner. Actually, I'm going to show you. This Yehuda Avner, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He wrote this book. It's called The Prime Ministers, because he served as a confidant to 4 Israeli prime ministers. I told you the story on Shabbos week. And he was a confidant to 4 Israeli prime ministers, and Yitzchak Rabin, Shamir, Menachem Begin, and Golda Meir. Those 4 prime ministers. And he was very close with all of them. And he was connected to the Rebbe, because all the prime ministers were connected to the Rebbe. All Israeli intelligence and personality and strategy would always go through the Rebbe's office. The Rebbe was intimately involved in everything that happened in Israel. So this young man, the prime minister, he was with one of the prime ministers in Israel, and they were traveling to America. For whatever reason, they were traveling, I think, to Washington, D.C. And he decided he's going to go and visit the Rebbe in New York. And he says that he got an appointment to visit the Rebbe in New York. At approximately 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, he would come into the Rebbe's office. That's when the Rebbe took private audiences. And he came into the Rebbe and he talked about Israel. The Rebbe asked him questions, strategic questions, a lot of questions about Israel, about the government, about the army. And as the time was nearing to the crack of dawn, as it was getting lighter outside, the Rebbe asked him a more personal question. He asked him, how come, Yehuda Avner, how come you're so connected to the Jewish people and to the Hasidim, how come you're not a Chassid? Something like that. That was the question that the Rebbe asked him. And he answered the Rebbe that he doesn't like that people ascribe powers to the Rebbe that the Rebbe himself doesn't even have. And the Rebbe went on to talk to him, and the Rebbe told him the following. The Rebbe said, this is my job. This is what I try to do. I try, and he showed him, he pointed his finger to a cabinet in the room. And he said, in that cabinet, you see that candle? And he sees, you see the candle? That candle is a lump of wax, essentially, with a wick inside of it. That's what a candle is. It's a lump of wax with a wick. You should know, the Rebbe tells him, that that candle does not fulfill its purpose of creation, why it was created, until somebody takes a match and lights the candle. Once the candle is lit, then that candle could give light and fulfill its purpose in the world. But as long as the candle is not lit, it's not fulfilling its purpose. So the Rebbe tells him the same thing is with a Jew. A Jew is a lump of wax. A body is the wax. And the Alter Rebbe gives this analogy later on. I think in chapter, later on in 38 or 39, the Alter Rebbe gives this analogy. He says that a human being is made up of a body. The body is like a lump of wax. And in the body, there is a soul. The soul is like the wick. But the Rebbe tells him that a Jew, even though he has a body and he has a soul, he's not fulfilling his purpose in the world for why God created him. Even though he has a body and he has a soul, and he's living many, many years in this physical world, he's still not fulfilling the purpose for why he was created. Until, the Rebbe says, until a Jew takes Torah and mitzvot, which are compared to Neir mitzvah, the Torah or, they're compared to Neir, they're compared to a candle, compared to light. When a Jew studies Torah, and when a Jew does a mitzvah, that's like taking the wick and lighting the wick. That is when the body and the soul are able to ignite and fulfill the purpose for why a Jew is created. That's what the Rebbe says. This is what the Rebbe is telling him. And the Rebbe looks at him and the Rebbe says, this is what I try to do. I try to light the candle, to light the wick of a Jew so that he could fulfill the purpose for why it was created. That's what I try to do. They continue talking. Yehuda Avner says they continue talking. And as they continue talking, I shared this video with you, right, Malka? I think I shared this video with you. As they continue talking, it's time to leave. And Yehuda Avner stands up and he's about to leave the room and he turns to the Rebbe and he asks the Rebbe, has the Rebbe lit my candle? That's what he asks the Rebbe. Has the Rebbe lit my candle? And the Rebbe looked at him and the Rebbe says, I can't light your candle. Only you could light your candle. Only a Jew could light his own candle. Nobody could light your candle for you. However, the Rebbe says, I have given you a match. I have given you a match. The match is what lights the candle. I have given you a match. I have given you the inspiration. I have given you the ability to connect to God and to study Torah and mitzvot on your own so that you can light your own candle. This is what the Alter Rebbe is telling us in chapter 2. A Jew is a veritable piece of God. A Jew has a soul, a godly soul within him that's always connected to God. However, the Rebbe says, Alter Rebbe says, that oftentimes we're not sensitive enough to experience this connection to God that we have. So that God places a tzaddik in every generation who's like the head, who connects the toenail, the fingers, the external parts of the body, which is us, and allows our souls to connect to the tzaddik soul. And when he connects to the tzaddik soul, he's able to be sensitive enough to be able to connect to God himself. This is what the Rebbe tells us in chapter 2 about the essence of the godly soul. And God willing, next week in chapter 3, we're going to begin talking about the characteristics, the makeup, the anatomy of the godly soul. Any questions? Any questions from the audience here? Anybody would like to ask a question?
So very interesting, the connection. Are we actually connected all the way to Avraham Avinu that way?
The Alter Rebbe is going to tell us later in chapter 26 that every single Jew inherited from Abraham, from Avraham Avinu, a very special nature. And that nature allows us a special soul. That nature allows a Jew to connect with God at will when he decides to, when he chooses to, because he's able to tap into this deep spiritual hidden love. That's what Alter Rebbe calls it, a hidden love that's hidden within the human psyche, the Jewish psyche. It's a love for God that's often hidden, but it's always there. And that love we inherited from Avraham Avinu. And that's one of the tools that Alter Rebbe is going to give us later on in Tanya. Alter Rebbe is going to give us tools how we can better connect to God. But first, Alter Rebbe, like we said, is giving us the ingredients. He's telling us what we're made up of. So next week, we're going to start chapter 3, which is the characteristics and the anatomy of the Jewish soul. We'll see you next week, God willing, 10:30 Port of Vallarta time. All the best.
Shavua Tov. Continue Shavua Tov. Thank you, Rabbi.